Hi everybody, I just wanted to record some of the questions that I'd like you to take a look at when we are reading this article by Noam Chomsky, What Makes Mainstream Media Mainstream. Now, we have to remember that Noam Chomsky is like an expert in language. He's a linguist. And so he is looking at language as a way of knowing certain things about media, for instance. So the interesting thing about our study is that we're using language to look at language. And so that's kind of a double investigation for us because we have to use language in order to study it. So some of the questions that I'd like you to take a look at when we read this article is in this first paragraph, he looks at he says that there's a lot of evidence about what's played up and what isn't and the way things are structured. So the question is, what is the evidence of what's played up and what isn't? So what is the what in that statement? And those structures that he mentions, how does structure in language change its message? Does structure in media text change the meaning in the language? So we'll be looking at those questions when we look at different types of media. Also, in this paragraph, when he says that when you look at the media or at any institution you want to understand, you ask questions about its internal institutional structure. And then he mentions these other things. But the interesting question that he mentions is, how do they relate to other systems of power and authority? So we have to consider Chomsky's question. How does the media relate to other systems of power and authority? When we read further in this article, we find that he goes into the different functions of various types of media. So I'd like you to be able to name them and discuss each of their functions. Then when we scroll down a little bit more, he goes into some claims about big media companies like these ones, the New York Times and CBS. And so our question that we want to answer is, what evidence would you need to know that what he claims in this article is true? In other words, how would Chomsky be able to prove to you that he is right about the big media companies that seem to be like corporations and what he calls tyrannies, hierarchic and controlled from above? Reading further, he mentions censorship, and he uses Animal Farm and George Orwell to talk about censorship and to introduce it. So I'd like you to be able to answer these questions. What is censorship? How do we know that society is being deceived through censorship? And do you think the media deceives? What kind of evidence do you have that that is true? Further down, we want to note in this section what Chomsky claims about the New York Times. Okay, so he claims that the New York Times is a corporation and it sells a product, and the product is the audience. So the very, very important question that I'd like you to think about and answer and discuss is, what is the value of an audience? Now, we know that media is produced for an audience. But which comes first, and which one shapes the other? That's the question. And then in this paragraph, when he says, then comes the hard work, and then he wants us to judge for ourselves, he wants us to judge for ourselves, and he says that you virtually never find anything in the social sciences that so strongly supports any conclusion, which is not a big surprise because it would be miraculous if it didn't hold up given the way the forces are operating. So we've got to know what are the forces that are operating and how come there is no proof in the social sciences. We read further, And Chomsky claims that there are three currents. Okay, I'm just looking for that. Yes, basically there are three currents to look at. So what does Chomsky claim about the three currents? What are they, and what is their purpose for existence? What are their influences on the way that society thinks? I'd like you to answer those questions as well. And then here he gives us a long history, a little history about how the three currents came about in American society. So I'd like you to know that. And then this is his very influential idea, his popular idea, which is not really his. He says that this is from a person called Walter Lippmann. And he coined this phrase called the manufacture of consent. Okay, so I'd like you to look at the claims about what this manufacture of consent is, and what ways do you see this sort of construct in modern media. Then at the end of this article, he mentions this word diversion. And diversion is mostly taken to mean something that takes our attention away from something else. For instance, Facebook is a diversion for studying media, for instance, for this class. So instead of studying your media, you're going to go into Facebook and divert your attention or take it away. So what do you think of this word diversion? Do you think that he is right, that media is simply a diversion that keeps us from knowing the real truth?